Thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction. So I appreciate this, and I'm happy to be with all of you in Santiago, virtually, unfortunately. Okay, let me just get into the share screen. Share. All right, here we go. So let me also get into the full slideshow here. There we go. So you can see the first slide, right? And the us at the bottom or at the top or wherever we are on your screen. Well, thanks again for having me and for also giving me the opportunity to think out loud with you about narrative. And here I don't just want to tell you what I think is going on with narrative, what it is and how I use it, but I want to try to place it in a larger context of qualitative methods and methodology. And then, I'm particularly grateful for having the opportunity on Friday to really dig a little bit in, and I always call that playing with some data and showing, telling, but also trying out different kinds of interpretive frameworks that we typically bring from different ends, sometimes to the same data, unfortunately, rarely, but to the data that we work with. Good. Having said that, the way I want to use the next 40 minutes or so is to take you through a bit of what I call thinking about qualitative. What is qualitative these days, these years, and how does then narrative fit into this? And there are quite a bunch of different approaches to narrative, as well as to qualitative methodology. So that's what I want to get a little bit into. And I want to start by drawing your attention to a new volume by Paul Kamek, Qualitative Research in Psychology. So this is the volume that is coming out this year. And this is the old one, the first edition by Paul and others from 2003. And what I want to do is, in my next slide, is go through the way the new volume is structured. So it gives us a little bit of an idea of a lens of what happened over 20 years almost, within qualitative, within a way of using a methodology that was knocking 30 years ago, 40 years ago on the doors of psychology. And by now, I want to argue it's almost fully integrated in it. That also gives you a little bit of an idea of where psychology was, where it is, and potentially also where it is headed. So Paul Kamek structured this new edition into two sections. The second section, the kind of traditional way of making sense of the different domains within qualitative. And the first section is kind of a theoretical introduction into the kind of pluralist ways of doing qualitative. Excuse me. Interestingly, there are two chapters in here on narrative. Chapter 4, which is more a general chapter, narrative in qualitative. And then there is chapter 6 by Michael Murray, narrative data and narrative analysis. And that's an excellent, I think, introduction into a way of using narrative methodology and applying it to different types of data. So what is interesting is what I have tried to color with green here. And these are new topics, new domains within qualitative. Participatory action research. Michelle Fine is the queen of participatory action research here in the United States. And so it's their chapter. Situational analysis is something also that emerged over the last decade. using video data, focused ethnography. We will talk a little bit more about ethnography later in this presentation, but then also Friday. To do qualitative longitudinal analysis, I think it's an incredibly interesting and important new enterprise. Mixed methods, and then I can see the bottom here. Okay, the development and evaluation research in qualitative as something, again, that is relatively new. And Heidi Levitt's meta synthesis chapter, something I hadn't heard of until 4 or 5 years ago. And now it is a big chunk in a research methods book on qualitative. Okay, that gives us a little bit of a context within which narrative also is situated here. But the question here already is, why narrative twice? And I asked Paul that chapter, Paul Kamek, that question, and his answer was, interestingly, he said, look, narrative reaches into all these other domains, into almost all kinds of qualitative research. And that's why we need to think about it more broadly before we specify it and do a kind of how-to chapter. And that got me thinking, is that really the case? Because there is a movement within narrative research that has this type of narrative über alles, as the queen, as the king, or whatever, dominate as a dominant discourse, almost, or a dominant narrative. And I have always been arguing, or trying to argue, against that. So that's something that is, I think, at the core here of something to worry about, and that's what I would like to disentangle a little. But before we get into this, let me take you through 5 principled ways of qualitative inquiry, of what I think is at the core of doing qualitative. And I framed it as allowing inductive methodologies, in contrast to the traditional way of doing psychology as a quantification and testing of hypothesis, the hypothetico-deductive way. But here it is more a way of bottom-up thinking about what kind of categories may be at work in the kind of, and that would be the second point, in the kinds of experiences or subjectivity that we now are a lot more interested in than we used to be 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So with this comes, as the third point, a blurring of the divide between researcher and what is being and how it is being researched. The participant orientation, and to a full degree in participatory research. We'll get a little bit into that as well, I hope. Then on this one, I am deviating from my idol, Jean Marachek, who in the first edition tried to argue that qualitative research does not have to have any implications on real life, I call it here. She framed it differently. She argued against the argument that qualitative research necessarily is progressive. So there's a little bit of a topic here of what we could discuss. What is the necessity of qualitative work in terms of making a contribution to whatever the issues are that are around us. And this last one, I think, fits the conference theme, your summer vacation, I think, best, because the way I framed it is taking language seriously. I mean, reconsidering what is language. And here, I was arguing that what we allow into the framework of doing inquiry is language as an intentional and cultural practice, that requires to take into account what bodies are doing and what also is usually taken out of language as a rational activity that is sitting in the mind, so to speak. And that is the affective way of engaging in language, in talk, in ways of communicating and doing relational work. So that's where I want to end up here today, of laying out a little bit of what it is in and with language that we do when we do qualitative work, but then in particular narrative work. And that's what I want to, I hope, get it more into detail Friday during the workshop. So having said that, let's get into how narrative fits qualitative inquiry and what are the different notions of narrative that are circulating these days or in the last 20, 30 years. Okay, and the way I divided the narrative world, so to speak, is into three categories, and I will cycle through them in more detail. A more literal way of understanding what narrative is, and that is a story, a text, or the storytelling activity. More about that in a minute. The second kind of category is where narrative has become a proxy, a metaphor. And this is where it encompasses, it captures people who are doing work on memories, people who are doing work on experience, where then narrative is a metaphor for life. And then also, and this, it faded out a little bit, as a metaphor for human existence. I think that was a framework in moral philosophy. Well, we'll get into that in a second. That was circulating in the 80s and 90s of last century. So, and then we'll turn to the third category, where narrative is a proxy for, it's a version, it's an organization strategy, similar to some people who do work in metaphor analysis. Okay, so let's move into the first one and work through that with a little bit more detail. So what we have here is the division of narrative as a text, as something that has a particular format, a form, a structure, also a plot. Plot is something between content and structure. And then there's a middle, there's content, there's something that story, the text, is about. Yeah, and this is particularly captured here on the left-hand side. This is where hermeneutic analysis as a way of doing text interpretation, yeah, circling around with different types of sub-methods, so to speak, of what the meaning is of the text that is captured somewhere supposedly in the text, but also brought to the text in the ways the text has been interpreted. The Bible, of course, is the prototype over centuries, yeah, and now is still a piece that is being interpreted. So where the interpretation of the text and the text itself come together. But it never, according to the hermeneutic framework, you'll never have a full understanding. It's always an approach. It's getting closer and closer and closer, applying the same methods again, over again, cycling through the circle and approaching an understanding of what is at the core of typically a text. This is also where in qualitative methods, grounded theory, that was one of the first that was pushing qualitative methods as a way of inductively arriving at categories that are relevant for understanding a text. And this is where content and thematic analysis, I think, are at home. And that's the type of method I think most of our students here in the United States, at least, who do qualitative work are anchoring themselves, are positioning themselves. And I think there are more problems with content analysis than promises for being on a safe ground. We'll get a little bit into that as well. And then there's something that is, I think, very well respected in Europe, less so here in the United States. I don't know about Latin America and Brazil, that is called metaphor analysis, an interesting way, again, basically of working with texts. Now, in contrast, on the right-hand side, we are focusing within this overarching approach of looking at narrative in a more literal way, at the telling of stories. And this is where, I marked myself with a little blue star here. My own anchoring is in discourse analysis and positioning analysis. But there are broader approaches. Conversational analysis, I don't think, is a broader approach. It's a more narrow approach. And typically, when I'm with conversation analysts, and they ask me where my relation is, I describe it as I'm flirting with conversation analysis. And I was yelled at one point publicly that you can't do that. You have to be in love with conversation analysis. And I don't know about that. I really don't know about that. But anyway, that's a small story as an aside. Symbolic interaction theoretical framework and action theory in itself, I think, are also within this domain of looking at the actual telling activities and analyzing them. So what I would like to summarize in the bottom line here is that in none of these, you do need to borrow, as a researcher doing your inquiry, you don't need to borrow into an interiority from where a text comes to origin or where the interpretation is necessarily anchored. It is available to kind of the public domain, so to speak, of where narratives surface as texts or as interactive activities. We'll return to this. And actually, I want to give a little bit of an example here quickly. This is a story here that is interesting, I thought. Obama is in October 2020 in Philadelphia, giving a presentation, a speech for Biden-Harris right before the election in the United States. So, and he tells a story, namely he tells the story that he was in Philadelphia, where he is again now, and delivered a speech at the Constitution Center. That was in August. So that was for the National Democratic Convention. And in that presentation, he gave another story, namely that he was sitting in the Oval Office with both men running for president. So it is an embedded story, the green part, I will play it in a second, that is embedded in the yellow story, presented here and now, made relevant for being in Philadelphia again in October 2020. So let's take a listen.
We are not, at least I am not, I can't listen.
I'm not having
either. You can't hear it?
No. No. Maybe you have to share screen again. And
no. Can you still hear me?
Yes, it's very low, the volume. I think it maybe.
Okay, let me try this.
That last time I was in Philadelphia, I was at the Constitution Center. And I was delivering a speech for the Democratic National Convention this year. And I said during that speech, I've sat in the Oval Office with both of the men who are running for president. And they are very different people. I explained that I never thought Donald Trump would embrace my vision or continue my policies, But I did hope, for the sake of the country, that he might show some interest in taking the job seriously. But it hasn't happened.
Okay, so I think I continue without earphones. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so let's throw the earphones away and do it live. Okay, and so we don't have the time here now, but Friday I want to go into this type of stuff. I mean, why is he quoting himself, so to speak? And I went back and he quotes himself word by word. I mean, this is another kind of the indirect speech. When we quote others, what are we doing in those situations? Okay, but here the example was supposed to serve the function of what is a story, and how is the kind of story embedded in what is happening in the context. That is, again, at the core of what I want to go into and show and tell and take apart of how this is done on Friday in the workshop. This is just a little bit of foretaste, but also good because were able to test out the audio and the video. So moving on from here, we are turning to the second way of or even a wave of making sense of narrative research and qualitative. And I will try to speed up a little bit in order to have more time for discussion at the end. So there are people who are doing memory work. They are looking into and asking basically the question of their participants, can you tell me about what you remember from when there was an earthquake? I gather you have earthquakes in Chile quite a bit. And earthquake narratives or memories are here something that is potentially of interest to a research project. Or now I think there's a wave of how do you remember when you first time heard about the epidemic or the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. So getting into memories. In contrast, but overlapping with, can you tell me about your experience of, what were you thinking, feeling? How did this resonate with you? When the first time you heard, or your daily rhythms of how you experienced the pandemic, as an example. So this is where moving into the domain of experience looks like it is something deeper, sitting deeper than memories. And now the next one was the big wave of biography research. Tell me about your life, or at least now it would require somebody to talk about their experience and what they remember about the pandemic as part of their life experience. So you go into earlier events, and typically the prototype of biography research is anchored, I think, very deeply in the research that comes from therapeutic orientations. So you go back to your childhood and unravel your life the way you see it, you frame it. So this is where life becomes the proxy, or rather the other way around. Narrative is the proxy for life, making sense of life. And as I mentioned earlier, this has been expanded into narrative research in philosophy in particular, that argues that narrative is the ability to frame life in terms of a narrative framework is at the core of human existence. From there, we can argue that something like morality and ethics come to existence. And as I mentioned before, I think that has not disappeared, but it has gone a little bit underground. It is based on some very early work by McIntyre, Alasdair McIntyre. And then it was celebrated and embraced in the 80s and 90s, and that's where it peaked. But I haven't recently come across new expansions of this type of using narrative as a proxy for morality, so to speak. So what I want to pull out here is that for doing this, taking this type of approach and doing this type of empirical work on memory, on experience, on life, and on human nature, essence, all presuppose borrowing into the assumption of there is an interiority, from where we can dig into memories, experience in order to get into life, get into the kind of essential aspects of sense making. And this is where people argued narrative is situated. Okay. Partly also, this is where a grounded theory, I don't know how to get back, but anyway, yeah, good. Partly where phenomenology is situating itself, and aspects of grounded theory as well, that can assume, as at least, or make these types of assumptions, that the categories that are in the text or in the interaction, that they come from originally some form of interior ways of making sense of being. All right, so moving on from there into the last domain of narrative, and the way narrative is used as a metaphor, as a proxy, was and is narrative as a version, as a version of making sense in terms of either collectively or individually, also imposing a umbrella. Narrative as an umbrella is possibly a nice metaphor for this type of strategic ways discourse about narrative. Sometimes it just surfaces when people say, so what's your story? What's your opinion? What is your way of making sense of X, of Y, of whatever happened? And here I would like to distinguish between two ways of making use of narrative as a sense-making strategy. One is running under the header of master narrative, and the other under the header of counter-narrative. Now, counter-narrative originated or came to existence as a way also of trying to understand how these kind of dominant discourses are actually changing, are in flux. Are there intrinsic principles that we can make use of in order to show how dominant discourses over time have changed and are in the process of changing? And counter-narrative was then, I think, the deliberate intent to also not just give master narratives as principles of sense-making an intrinsic notion of there is change, but also that counter-narratives undermine, subvert master narratives, and by doing so, push for change in a more agentive way. So there's this dynamic of master and counter that has entered, I think, for the last 10, 15 years, the discourse of narrative and narrative sense-making and using narrative for narrative research. I want to draw one more attention to one more distinction. I think that is important, because master narrative in contrast to counter, is used often with the connotation of hegemony, master narrative as a hegemonic narrative, as a hegemonic sense-making strategy, also called a capital D discourse or master discourse. And I think that's where counter gets its potential, and to analyze narratives with regard to what are they countering, if they are countering, and not just complicit with dominant discourses. That's where it gets its potential. However, master narrative has this, I think, more basic connotation, that master narrative, first of all, is referring to background assumptions. And these are, in a way, dominant background assumptions that rule, so to speak, our lives. We take them for granted, we share them, we bring them into almost every moment of using language, of using our bodies to make sense, of using our bodies to express emotions, etc., etc. And as such, they are not necessarily hegemonic. Yet the middle ground, or the ground, the difference between master narratives as background and master narratives as dominant and hegemonic discourse is slippery. But we've got to start with the assumption that without background, without master narratives, without capital D discourse, there wouldn't be any communication. We wouldn't be able to understand, because master narrative is referring to background and background assumptions. Very briefly, spreading that out a little bit, there's something that Searle called the deep background. And I think that is a very good way of looking at, again, language. What is embedded in our languages are assumptions about the human body, the way we see the world, that there is a front and a back, that there are two eyes looking at the world, that there are no eyes in the back behind us, that there's a right and a left. These are ways that are embedded in the way we talk. We make sense. These are shared background assumptions. And that's what Searle called the deep background. Very difficult to change the kinds of assumptions that are at work in this so-called deep background. In contrast, Searle had this bipart distinction to background assumptions that are culturally shared. And I would put in age, race, gender, the kinds of norms and conventions that we typically share more regionally, and they are shared differently in different languages also, but then they are also shared in different dialects, up to the issue of idiolects, the way I speak, the way you speak, when we use the same language, etc. Now, these categories that come to existence, but they are also already kind of sitting on a shelf in a way and being borrowed as background assumptions, they are more easily processed to change. Our ways of making sense of sexuality, for instance, over the last 20 years, last 40, 50 years maybe, I think has, I think really interestingly changed. And again, here we would most likely be arguing that there has been progress, that the change is moving in a certain direction. We may touch on that a little bit more in a second as well. Now, what I added with some of my colleagues is a third layer of background assumptions. And these are typically situated in the here and now. These are assumptions about the micro work that is going on in situations when people are together, when people are speaking, talking with each other. The way we use our hands, gaze, and gaze is an interesting one, because I think right now, with what we are doing, interestingly, we are moving into the gaze patterns that we take for granted, typically, when we are face to face. And now behind masks, I think in particular, we will begin to read eye gaze differently, because we don't have access anymore to the rest of the facial expression. And the facial expression, I think, is incredibly important, but also incredibly under-researched when it comes to taking language seriously. What we do with our bodies and how we do what we do with our bodies. And we have the means by now, using video data, for instance, where we can stop and replay and go over it again. It's coming. It's knocking on, it has been knocking on our doors of doing qualitative research that moves into the minutiae of the micro assumptions that are at work when talk is taking place. So unpacking a little bit about this background that is not necessarily hegemonic, but which is at work, and it can be and will be and is being analyzed by some of us, beginning to at least to move into these domains of taking language seriously, and in particular with regard to storytelling activities. All right, so moving on from here, I'm a little bit early, I think 8:15. No, I'm almost over time. Oh, sorry. Okay, so let me rush through the last 3 slides. So how does narrative stand out or is different? And also, what is missing when we do narrative research? When we tell stories, we design characters in the there and then in the story realm, and we give it a kind of a temporal contour, beginning, a middle, and an end. This lends itself in particular for the organization of what I call navigation, also of constancy and change, of something that is there at the beginning and it is maintained, or it wasn't there at the beginning and it comes to existence in the temporal dimension of the story. So that is part of the content where identity research is moving into the organization of characters in the story and the way these characters are manipulated, navigated through time. Taking language seriously now means that we, on the one hand, are able to look at the representation of these characters, and the representation of language, which is different from the way language is used when we interact as a bodily means. When I say is different, there is a different analytic take. On the one hand, using language as in the form of its represented means, language as a tool for representation, typically sitting in the mind, for some people even in the brain, where you have to dig into the brain or the mind in order to get at those kinds of aspects that are represented. In contrast to where the body acts using language and the body gives the cues that are being understood, where the meaning, so to speak, is between bodies. So what I'm trying to get at already is a different notion of, or different work with interiority and or exteriority. Excuse me. Let me summarize this, and stepping a bit here into interiority, because that's what I promised with the title. I think there are basically 4 different ways of dealing with interiority. The traditional way in psychology is in the interior That's where it's at. Yeah, identity, selfhood, subjectivity is sitting somewhere inside, and it's typically viewed as a, metaphorically here, a commando bridge from where, yeah, I am being told of what to do and what not to do and how to do it, etc. And in a recent paper, I don't know whether you had access to that, Martin Dege and we are arguing that this is coming out of a Euro tradition of thinking about the person. And it's a very Eurocentric way that has become a dominant discourse within psychology. Okay. And not that there's anything wrong with this or right here, but there are certain kind of constrictions and refinements that follow from that. So in contrast, the second way of making sense of interiority, if you want to call it, is it's all in between the people, as I just tried to juxtapose. That's where meaning comes to existence. That's where it's at. That's where the commando bridge is organizing how we make sense as individuals, but as communities, as societies, as cultures. Good. There's a fourth position, and I think this is Marie-Cécile's position, who was last year, had the opportunity to be in Santiago, and I'm so jealous. Okay, I think it's her position that it's both, and it needs to be accessed as both. The fourth position, it's none of them, and I think there are two different positions. One is, all this stuff about subjecthood identity is a grand illusion. There is no such thing. We could entertain that, and there are people who have been entertaining that big time. I think I am flirting with the last one here. Maybe that distinction between interior and exterior is a wrong one. And maybe there are alternatives that are sitting outside. So at least I think it's an unproductive one. Maybe not false or right or whatever, but there may be ways to think more productively about what traditionally is captured in this interiority, exteriority distinction. Summarizing and foreshadowing what I want to do on Friday. Because now at this point, it would be time for me to launch into, okay, what is narrative analysis, the way I understand it, and how do I do it, and blah, blah, blah. Not going to do that here, but we play with this on Friday. But what is, I think, relevant here is that we start from a qualitative background, from a qualitative master narrative, so to speak, where we assume that we can learn from those who we work with and work with their stories, their story making in the interaction with others in storytelling activities, practices, we call it. And the ethnographic background, I think, is one where we have to start by questioning description, where we have to start with assumptions that question the assumptions that we bring into interpretation. So that's what I would like to start with on Friday, and then work this up to questioning a couple of other taken for granted assumptions in qualitative research, namely, excuse me, let me just get a little bit of something to oil my voice. This is not alcohol, this is coffee. Okay. All right. Questioning assumptions, namely that are circulating in the qualitative network, that we are capturing or able to capture and analyze experience. Yeah, no, right. What is going on when we make those arguments? Are we really working inductively, and if so, to what degree? Yeah, capturing the categories that others are working with. To what degree is that actually possible? And what are we bringing into the assumptions when we claim that we are working inductively? It was a good argument in contrast to the hypothetical deductive method, but we are on turf here that is interesting. I wanted to say problematic. No, it's interesting. And then also our role as participants in research. Yeah, we are participating in similar ways as our participants are participating in research, but we are not the same. Yeah, so there are certain ways of differentiating and integrating the kind of role is, I think, the wrong word, but the kind of engagement that we have as soon as we step into wanting to do inquiry and research. So summarizing what I've tried to do in the last 45 minutes now is giving a little bit of an integration of narrative and narrative methods, narrative analysis of what that may look like, consequences, in the larger frame of qualitative methodology. And I touched on ethnography and sub-touched on other qualitative methods. So what I did not cover and left out here are these new ways of integrating not only narrative, but also other qualitative methods within to the larger way of making our enterprise of starting PhD work and continuing PhD work, and then making contributions within psychology and also to other social science disciplines. What I have left out are these really interesting new analytic approaches like situational, like longitudinal approaches, critical participatory action research. So, and I, quite honestly, I don't know enough about these kinds of approaches to really unfold it and integrate narrative or differentiate narrative and narrative analysis from them productively for you. But I hope that this opens up a little bit of a way of moving deeper into a discussion that is qualitative, critical, and also in a way of bringing in the philosophical assumptions, the assumptions that we in general bring into doing inquiry. So I will end it on that and leave you there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike, for your talk. It was very, very interesting. Now we have a little bit more than half an hour to have a discussion. I want to ask you if it is possible, if you can turn on your cameras so we have at least the illusion that we're discussing and seeing each other. We want to ask you two things. First, if you want to make a question, please use the hand tool from Zoom, because we don't see all of you. So, it also helps us with the order of the questions. And if you have a question and you have problems with English, or you're not, I don't know, if you're not comfortable with speaking in English, we can help you with that, and we can informally translate the questions and everything. So please, we open this to discussion.
Well, I cannot raise my hand because I'm host, but
you can do it.
yes. But I have. May I start the discussion?
Yes.
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you very much for your talk. I think it's very comprehensive and and useful for many of us. And I have, yeah, many reactions, I would say. I will try to tackle them all briefly, and then you can pick up whatever you want. The first, of course, is the idea of an interiority, because you, I think, well, you said that this self-identity, subjectivity, and so on are different ways, hegemonic ways to understanding interiority. And in that sense, interiority would be something like, of course, produced by these master narratives or hegemonic stories about ourselves, about the person. And then you said, well, there is no, I think you said there is no interiority, something like interiority. All we have is something that is in between us. And yes, of course, you know, I could agree with that idea, in the sense that interiority as a special idea of the self is misleading. Yes, because of course, what constitutes us is not something, is nothing, probably is not an entity, is not something as a different substance from the exterior. It's not necessarily something that it's inside our skulls. So that makes sense. But on the other hand, I would say that there is something that needs to be accounted for. You know, this idea of interiority, yeah, it's misleading, but in a way is pointing to something that might be important. In what sense? In the sense that, and here I think that we may confuse two levels of analysis: a genetic level of analysis and an ontological level of analysis. Because from an ontological point of view, you say, yeah, we don't have interiority is nothing, is not a different substance from exteriority. So, okay. But from a genetic point of view, you can think and you can accept that there is a private experience that is not, it may have a same nature, like social nature, but it's different from our interpersonal experience we have every day. And in some day, for example, I found myself many times thinking that, oh, thanks, we are grateful that we can think privately and nobody, you know, knows what we are thinking. So we have that. I mean, that's it's something that is valuable, to be able to think, to feel, and in a way that others cannot know. I mean, not necessarily, of course, we express many of our thoughts and our feelings and so on, and that's inevitable. But there are other things that are, in a way, or can be private. So in this sense, I would say that what you call interiority needs to be accounted for, because it has to do with some kind of social process that plays a very important role in our private lives and psychological experiences, and you can account for that again with social means. I mean, for example, with the idea of inner speech. Yeah, I mean, if you acknowledge that narratives, that language, that speech is something that is mainly social, then you can accept that when you have a speech experience with yourself, well, there is something social going on, but at the private plane in a way. And that allows you to do different things. you do some things with others, speaking with others, but you do different things speaking with yourself. So in a way, and I'm sorry, it's too long, but it's just to say that there are social ways to make sense of this kind of interiority, and I would say that it's important to do it. It's not just to say, oh, interiority is like a Western patriarchal notion. Let's throw it away. I mean, we need to think about this phenomenologically. Why we have this kind of inner experience in a way, and which social functions, but also psychological function this experience may play. So that's my first reaction, the idea of, or maybe an invitation to think of interiority with your own proposal. I mean, with your, for example, with narratives, with language, and so on. Why don't do that? So that's the first thing. Then two or three very, very brief points. The first is a question, is the idea of master narrative. And what is the relationship between the idea of master narratives and Foucault notion of discourse, basically? I mean, I don't know if, or discourse with this capital D, are they the same? Are they different? And this also makes me think about the relationship between language and narrative. Your notion of narrative, how does it relate with a notion of language? What is language for you? And how does language relate with narrative? Well, I think that's probably more than enough.
Good. Can I have another 45 minutes? All right. Okay. Let's try to briefly tackle interiority. Look, this may be misunderstood, but okay. Let me put it in two ways. I mean, the first one is provocative, and I just heard that my colleagues of the executive board of the Division 5 that I have the image of being provocative. And I thought, geez, this is interesting. Okay, let's be provocative for a second. Look, Antonia, I'm not taking your privacy away. I'm not, I'm not, your secrets are safe. So our secrets are safe. Yeah. But if we begin to move into this notion of privacy as a place, as a location of where we want to be, we have a different ballpark. Yeah, we are entering the discussion about public and private, and the history of what is considered public and what is considered private, and that's where we are deep, almost in trouble in a European way of looking. And I don't think that is just me. I think this is for folks who are at least white in Southern America or in Asia. We are deep involved, engaged in the discourse that originated in Europe and claims superiority. What we are not taking into account is alternatives to ways of making sense between private and public. So that is about privacy and interiority. They are not the same. The argument that we put forth when we argued that interiority, and in conjunction with the belief that we are able to access our own interiority by way of reflection, by using a notion of reflection, again, that is grounded in the coffee house culture of, and I'm not just saying it's a male thing, but it used to be a male thing in Europe, of where man gathered and claimed what rational discourse is and how to do it, where it became part of the bodily practices over centuries of a particular way of doing, not just rationality, of doing, and this is even, now I'm saying something that I haven't said before, of doing whiteness, of being in the world as white, as white folks, how we make sense. So that's where the issue of interiority and the issue of the assumption of being able to reflect on interiority by rational principles, that's where we are situating it. And what we are excluding is potential alternatives. And this is where I borrowed from Linda Tuhiwa Smith, a Maori woman, scholar in New Zealand. Because she argues, look, there are ways in, and I wouldn't say indigenous cultures, because she says, as an example, the Maori traditional way of sense making that are not borrowing interiority and reflection in order to end up in different ways of using language for sense making of, and we'll get a little bit more into this Friday, of positioning a sense of self with regard to others, navigating sameness and difference between folks, navigating a sense of continuity, discontinuity, of change and constancy, and also navigating agency of who is in charge. And there we get a little bit into Foucault. Is it the world that is dominating, making sense of who I am, of my body and me? Or is it an agency that comes from the person as a direction of fit and making world? So these three domains are navigated differently in different cultures by different folks. But if we borrow and take interiority as the place where it's at, and reflection to be the tool of getting at, and narrative then serving the function of reflectively getting at the interiority of the participants in our research, all I'm saying is we've got to rethink this in order to be able to consider alternative ways. And what I hear you saying is, no offense, no, we need to accept interiority because it is a belief that is so deeply seated in our sense-making strategies, in our dominant discourses, that we can't get rid of it. And that's what I would partly agree with. We can't just say it doesn't exist, because we believe we use interiority in our sense-making strategies, not just as psychologists, but also in our everyday speech. So that's what we have to account for. But it's not what is interiority, but rather how is it made sense of? How is it integrated? It is a belief, it is an attitude, it is a way that is integrated into our discourse, and as such, there it is analyzable. Very quickly to inner speech. I've thought a lot about inner speech. When I started reading Vygotsky, and Vygotsky in the 70s in Germany was our Bible, but it was the Bible to fight Chomsky, to fight the interiority that I only know by now that that's what was at stake. And that's where Vygotsky was, to us, to me, one of the very first who could be used as a weapon, sorry about the militaristic metaphors, yet the argument that Vygotsky made was that what is assumed to be internal is first of all external. And that was the powerful thing. For Vygotsky, it wasn't that now we have to look at internality of what is there, that inner speech, so to speak, as a metaphor for thinking, was the target for research, was the target for inquiry. No, it was actually what was taking place between mother and child in the zone of proximal development. That's where it was. And to us, to a large degree, it still is. All right, so about inner speech, and the last one was Master Foucault. Right, I mean, there are these in sociology, in European sociology, attempts to bring in subject and subjectivity in the way people now interpret the late Foucault as being quite open to sense-making that comes from, or that are brought in, what we call the direction of fit from person to world, where it is not only unidimensionally the direction of fit from world to person, where the person is part of the structural embeddedness of societal and historical traditions, but rather that there is a way of, and this would be exactly what the current interest in counter-narrative is trying to bring out. Counter-narrative is something that within these kinds of sociological sense-making strategies in Europe, at least, is gaining a momentum. Yeah, to move away from the social structure as dominating solely as an explanatory framework and seeing it as a bidirectional way within which then in particular to be able to explain social change. Yeah, because that's we have a problem of not being able to look at the kinds of changes that are taking place right now, right under our face, with new forms of communication, new ways of sense making that are not just all governmental, but they are part of a dynamic within which counter strategies are unfolding. And that's where we have to be very careful what kind of counter strategies we actually kind of privilege and which ones we are, I think, opposing. Yeah, with all the kinds of what are they called? The fake, okay, I leave it there. But I think that there is something out there that we have to that are forming new challenges to what we do and how we do when we talk about counter and master as the directions within which change is taking place, but not just taking place, but also can be influenced, can be managed in ways that are in line with what we would call progress and liberation.
Thanks. Can I just say something very, very brief? It's like, I don't think that interiority, I wouldn't call interiority what I think we need to think about. But anyway, I don't think that is important because it's an idea, because it's a belief. I think it's important because it has been produced historically by our ways of life. There is something, a way, a process, not just private, not necessarily inner, but a subjective. I know all the words are misleading in a way, but there is some kind of processes that are not necessarily in between physical or virtual people, in this virtual mediated by Zoom in this case, but there are also processes that occurs between virtualized people, and that we need to account for that, because that has been historically and materially produced by our ways of life. So I would say interiority is not just an idea that we can get rid of. Of course, we need to rethink about it. We need to rethink it, because if we think about interiority as an essence, as the starting point of anything, of subjectivity, of whatever, of course that's misleading. But it's not just an idea. It's something that we need. It's a process. Now it's a historically, materially produced and performed process that we need to account for. And that's why I think it's important. And that's why I think that, for instance, your notion of narrative could be a way to making sense of this, not just of the way we relate with other people, but also in the way we relate with ourselves. Because what you call interiority, for me, it's a relation with ourselves. I mean, it has to do with that ourselves are not one thing, but are multiple instances, social instances that are constantly relating one to each other and performing this relationship. And that's what we need to
okay, let me just say one or two things. Right. I mean, don't call it an idea, but call it a construct. And I think that's where we would agree. Identity, interiority, subjectivity, these are constructs. Now, and there are two kinds of constructs. On the one hand, these are constructs I, we, you are working with in our everyday communication. And that's why I think there's a legitimate argument they need to be researched. Good. They are also a construct of you and me as researchers. We use them as constructs in order to get at these second level, primary level, at these constructs that people are working with. I don't care whether identity exists or interiority exists or whatever. We are working with them as constructs in our research, in our inquiry, in the kind of methodology that we carry into fields of our inquiry. So, notion of construct, and I think we agree on this, makes it possible to get into, and I would say we don't get into the interiority of people, but we get into the construct, the way they construe their whatever it is. But we are interested in how they make sense, of themselves, of others, living in the world, doing what they're doing. And as such, we don't really need to believe in the idea of interiority or exteriority, but we work with them. Okay, so I think that's all I know about interiority.
Yes, I would want to make a question. It's very close to Antonia's question. Of course, I don't agree with Antonia at some points, but what I want to ask you, it's about another option of interiority. I understand the fourth one, the fourth one you use, that it's an illusion, interiority and exteriority. But what if we think them not as something that that's an illusion, or that it's right. It's not there. I understand, like, some Foucauldian interpretations can be taken like that, especially the less interpretation of Foucault, like when it's always an unfolding from the exterior to the interior. So, but what if we could think them as, for example, as mobile things, as movement? Like, sometimes some things get constituted as interior and exterior, but that's not fixed. And I think we can think of interactions where some things that are interior in some interaction or in some situations, and I'm thinking materiality as material situation, to use Karen Barat's concept as a material arrangement, like some things are interior and other things are exterior. So, but if you go to another material arrangement, another thing become interior and other things become exterior. I'm thinking on Antonia's example of secrets, for example. Sometimes it's in your interior and your mind stays there. So, and you expect it will stay there, but you have other situations, what is actually in your, as a secret or in your mind, you actually expect it to go outside. And I'm thinking about situations where interiority, it's not important, or maybe it's not like there, or an exteriority, it's not there also another. So can we think them as mobile or something that it's constituted in movement?
Okay, right. I mean, look, on that slide at the bottom, I try to divide. I mean, there are people in particular in the postmodern ways of, in literary circles, where the argument is that, you know, reflection, even rationality is we are done with that discourse. It was a grand illusion. It was. I don't want to go there, illusion or not. That's not helpful. So my was more at the bottom of the. Are there ways of getting out of that trap? It's trapping us, and the discussions are trapping us, inside, outside. I was trapped there a couple of years ago because people thought that my way of an analysis is the outside. I'm doing discourse that is outside of the individuals. And so they had in an identity handbook a chapter of a person on discourse inside and a person on the outside. And then they had a discussant, a good colleague friend of mine, who was discussing us. And I said, no, I'm not an outside person. I want to be the discussant of the inside and outside, because I think, I want to show how the two ways of juxtaposing them are trapping us. And, in particular, I think if I understand you correctly, you want to look at process, at flux, and I don't want to call it now the connection between inside and outside, because then we accept it already. Can we jump outside the inside-outside distinction, so to speak, in order to look to find alternative ways? And I think this is where indigenous discourse theoreticians like Linda Smith are pointing us to look at relationality as a way that does not require inside-outside, but as a way of connecting bodies, language, where language is, if we want to use that metaphor, that language is the umbrella and bodies are part of it, but you can turn that around. But again, the distinction between bodies and language is a problematic one, and we need to unify it, and we are on its way by doing exactly the kind of microanalytic inquiry where we integrate micro cues that are at work in situations, and we are able now to relate it to the kinds of master discourses that are socially at work while we speak. Bringing these aspects of being in the world, so to speak, together. I think that's where we are headed, not only in psychology, but also in related disciplines.
Thank you. There are more questions. Javiera has her hand. Javiera Navarro. Prende el micrófono, Javi.
Yes. Hello. I would like to insist in Antonia's last question about the notion of language that you're using when you think about narratives. Michael, if you could comment on that, please.
Okay. Narrative to me is a discourse. It's a particular discourse mode. There are descriptions, as a different discourse mode. A narrative is not a description, a description. There are arguments, and they partly overlap. You can argue with a narrative, but not all narratives are arguments. So there are different discourse modes. Narrative is one. And as such, narrative is not a privileged discourse mode at all. Yeah, they are all language discourse modes, talk modes. Narrative has one thing that makes it stand out for us as psychologists, and that is narrative represents a temporal contour. When I argue, when I describe, I'm not able to make use of a temporal framework, and only within a temporal framework we can unfold whether things are the same over time or things are changing or have changed. So the temporal contour is something that is specific to narrative, and that lends this particular discourse mode to become, careful, it's not narrative über alles, but it is narrative as privileged when it comes to navigate identity. Identity as being different and same with regard to others. Identity as navigating agency, yeah, as being coming from the world, imposing itself on us, but also as we, as individuals, as communities, as cultures, imposing meaning on our ways of life, on being in the world. So the two-dimensionality of agency, the two directions of fit, I call this, that is being navigated in other discourse mode as well. Temporality gives narrative a special kind of situatedness, a special means, a special way. And that's why biography researchers jumped on narrative. Yeah, and that's where I think narrative was able to gain that momentum in the 70s, 80s, 90s with Brunner, Polkinghorne, and McIntyre, to become the metaphor for life, yeah, as the organizer for life, and gain the momentum even to become the principle by which morality is being organized. Yeah, and I don't know about that. I wouldn't want to go there. I think that's an overestimation of exactly this small issue of temporality, where narrative is different from other discourse mode. And that's where they all are embedded in language activities. And when we analyze language activities, I am pushing for doing language analysis situated, and not these grand kind of biographies, or well, in German we would say an Entwurf, you know, kind of a way of a version of life, giving a version of life. That's not what narrative is for me, and definitely that's not how I approach narrative when I do narrative analysis. Does that help a little? I'm trying. Okay, but thank you for the question, for trying to clarify this. Javiera.
We're going to take a few more minutes because we had like a 30 minutes break, so we can continue the discussion.
Absolutely.
Good. Sebastian, I understand that maybe if you have trouble.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Great. No, I just wanted to come back to the question of interiority. I'm a researcher working, like trying to understand the relationship between self-narratives and psychological suffering. So again, for me, in my research, it's pretty hard to get rid of the concept of interiority. And I'm gonna give you a very simple example. One of my participants was telling me that while he was in a dance club, he was all the time thinking and talking to himself, oh, I'm dancing like a woman, so I'm not gonna be desired by other men. I'm working with non-heterosexual masculinities. And that was like an inner dialogue, an inner, like a soft talk, a soft talk. So how do you relate to that? How do you relate to that concept of like between like mental health, psychological suffering, and interiority? Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but that doesn't mean much. I know. But when you said it felt like an inner dialogue, I mean, that was kind of telling to me. Yes, it looks like it. Yeah. In particular, I think when, and now I'm speaking metaphorically, when people are on the couch. Yeah. The assumption is that they are moving into what other people would call feels like an inner dialogue. But let me start from a different perspective, because these are the kinds of conversations that we typically have. That people who work with the assumption of an inner dialogue, they try to appeal to an understanding of inner dialogue by the metaphor that we are speaking to ourselves. And I used to always say, what do you mean you're speaking to yourself? And what you say, it feels like an inner dialogue. And then I said, I don't talk to myself. I remember we were sitting downstairs here and had a dinner conversation where this exact topic came up. And these were colleagues, 2 sociologists, 2 psychologists, and we were arguing. And I think I was the only one who claimed, no, this is 20 years ago, that I'm not talking to myself. But lately, I'm finding myself more talking to myself, but I'm talking to myself when I'm yelling at myself, I want to call it. Good, yeah. So what is that? What is that speech act that I am more and more beginning to engage in? It may have to do with age. But in this paper that Martin Dege and I wrote, it just went off the other day, we are trying to show how the assumption that we actually that we feel that we are talking to ourselves is embedded in conventions, in conventional thinking that were born in a European way of filtering and moving the subject out of its social domain, where it became possible slowly to contrast the subject and nature as something that is outside of us. Yeah, and again, the way I read, at least how Maori traditions, and I it's a funny thing, as an aside, I teach Maori, but I don't speak it. Which is kind of interesting. But I tried to learn and learned a good chunk of Maori that helps me to understand that the way of making sense of the person within a cultural framework is substantially different, let me use the word that I don't like, is essentially different from the way the Eurocentric way of making sense of self, subject, and identity has infiltrated and germinated psychology, first in Europe, and then moved with Freud coming to my university, and bringing that type of way of sense making to the United States, where it fell onto fertile grounds, where people began, that's possibly wrong, because they already were talking to themselves. But it was the fertile ground now where it feels like a natural thing to talk to ourselves, to separate yourself from yourself and talk to yourself. Yeah, imagine that. Why would anyone do that? Okay, that's bringing a foreign and potentially Maori indigenous perspective to the kind of, and I wouldn't call it a Western. This is a particular tradition of a particular modernity that came to existence, and we in psychology in particular have made it our Bible. And that's what I would like to step back from and open the door to alternative ways of making sense. All right, I mean, this is not the answer to explain what you experienced with your client. And in particular, I don't think this helps people like you who are dealing with people's individual suffering. Yeah. So there is a space for that. But on the other hand, I also want to push that argument of what we do when we deal with individual suffering that we typically explain as a way of systemic experience of injustice and privilege and ways of making sense and accepting the principles of capitalism. Yeah, that's the other side within which people like you are operating. And to bring these sides together is, I think, part of people like me or Lorraine, but people who are not in the situation of doing clinical work, is our obligation. That doesn't help you, I know, but I think that's.
We have two more questions. I think it will be better if Marie-Cécile and Nicolas can talk, and then you can reply only for time issues. Is that okay?
Anything goes.
Okay, excellent. Marie-Cécile?
Hi, Michael. Hi,
Hey there.
everybody. Sorry, I was late. I didn't get the time thing, whatever.
Yeah, the time thing.
Okay, but interiority is, of course, very interesting. I have a couple of remarks, and so I totally agree on the cultural historical reading of that construct, as you call it. I would call it a practice. I totally agree on that. It is, you can locate it into a certain type of modernity, doing modernity in certain certainly positioned and postured bodies with each other, etc. I totally agree with that. What I still find interesting is what language does in that construction. And this allows me to take I think it allows me to take a broader look at the whole of how language works as an activity, as a practice in different cultures. So I would say what is interesting in Vygotsky's inner speech notion is the change in function, the change in form, this change in structure, and this change in semantics he is noticing. So this is much more interesting than locating inner or outer, outside, inside, outside. The container, this discourse we have here is very Euclidean, very simple, very oversimplifying containers. So the space notion the container notion needs to be criticized, first of all, in order to get to the movement, like Alejandra was mentioning. So space is differently conceived in terms of processes, in terms of movements, in terms of permeability and changeability, in terms of heterogeneous spaces. What Antonia was alluding to, the heterogeneity of spaces moving into, we have heterotopias and chronotopes. We have different possibilities here to do that. But what is interesting to me is how language seems to be performed by people in different situations, giving way to what Vygotsky constructed as inner speech. So, and he takes Jakubinsky as his starting point, and Jakubinsky's idea of language, and he's a linguist, he's not interested in psychology. Jakubinsky says the better we know somebody, or the more in love we are with somebody, the less language we need. So it's abbreviation and it's intimacy. It's a form of, you know what I mean, I know what I mean, you know what I mean. We don't need to talk much and we can abbreviate. And this is another way of operating together. And then we have a certain practice that takes this up and mysticize it, if you like, right, to the way of reflection. I can get rid of others, I can get rid of my body, I can get rid of history, I can get rid of all this. So this is the Cartesian ego. This is the fantasy of total solitude, right? Grandiose solitude. But it's interesting to see that different practices lead really to different relationships to others. And I would say, I would claim that it's the case, this is the power of language to be highly elaborated and developed in its practices. And we have practices where it's much less developed and it doesn't need to be developed much. And it gives way to different functions and operations in all these cases. Each form has a different, opens to a different function and to a different sociality. So we are always social, that doesn't stop. But it's differently navigated, as you would say. So making sense is making form, also not only making sense. So this is, so I'm thinking with that, but I'm really interested how does language work in that, in these different articulations of being social. And then we could look at this in oral cultures, because we invented alphabetic writing and we had loud reading for a very long period of time. And then we invented silent reading. So this is a step, this is immensely important to understand this whole emergence of the inside fantasy and practice. It's really a practice. So there's a whole here that's going on with language forms, practices of sociality, which I find extremely interesting to understand how language works. I don't, like you, I don't care if there's an identity or not. I'm not interested in identity. I'm not interested in the self. I'm interested in how language works, how it works for us in our lives. And the forms we can see. And this is so brilliant. The extreme abbreviation, the extreme elaboration, oral and written, all what we have here. And this is from where I read inner speech, not inner. But we don't have words, as Antonio was saying. I call it individuals language activity, but it's also wrong. Of course, it's social. But yeah, okay. So just to agree, and also to insist on the idea of language, the work of language, language activity. And this brings back the body. We don't have to add it by some empirical analysis and say, oh, look, there is body. Yes, of course, it's always there. It's always there. It doesn't leave us. Thanks.
Nicolas?
Thank you, Alejandra. I was thinking, I had a remark between Sebastian and Michael's recent dialogue that through all this discussion, I was thinking that something bothered me about the distinction about the inner and the outside. Okay, so it's kind of binary, and those kind of thoughts, those kind of concepts are more than a trap than a way out of some problems. So I was thinking, how can we free ourselves from that trap? And I was thinking that a useful solution maybe it's to distinguish the inner dialogue that might or might not exist. I don't want to state anything about it, but separate the inner dialogue from talking to ourselves. I believe that those are two different concepts. If we tackle this exclusively from language theory, that might be a problem. But if we draw from psychological theory as well, I can think about at least 2 or 3 psychological theories, for example, that put the self outside of ourselves. You know, for example, Freud's idea of the self, Lacan's, I don't know how to translate it, but the mirror thing, el estadio del espejo, the mirror stage in Lacan, or in social psychology, a classical theory such as symbolic interactionism. All those theories put the self outside of ourselves. So when we talk with ourselves, we're not necessarily having an inner dialogue, or what Marisa C called it just now. It's something that is happening in a different area. I remember when I was doing my doctoral dissertation that I did it in narrative theory. I came across a paper that I really loved, and I just Googled it when you were talking recently. That is precisely from the Narrative Inquiry journal. And it was a paper called What is the Subject? Written by Shelley Daysclatter. And she proposed, again, drawing from psychological theory, not from language theory, that narratives, the relationship between narratives and the idea of a self, it's more of a transitional activity precisely between the psychological and the social. But it's not neither psychological nor social. It's something that has its both feet in both places at the same time. And at least for me, that's a useful solution out of this problem that is the inner dialogue or talking to ourselves, thinking that narrative and creating narrative and doing narrative and writing narrative, considering Michael's idea specifically of master narratives and counter master narratives, those are transitional devices, not just psychological, not just language. They have a different role, and that must be taking account not only language, but also social and psychological activity. That's about it. Thank you.
Okay, quickly. I think that's very cool. That's where I would like to, I mean, as a future way of integrating and also differentiating ways of sense making for psychologists and for others, that gives, that's an option, that's a possibility. So thank you. Marie-Cécile, thank you too. It was so amazing to hear your statement. And interestingly, I mean, I wrote that down. You said language is performed by people. Yeah. And you make language the subject, and then the people are not the object here, but it's language that is doing it to people. I've been quoted, and the quote is like this by Mark Freeman, my colleague, but we disagree on a number of big things. And he quotes me as saying, and I'm not interested in people, I'm interested in language. Okay, that's me, right? And I'm quoting Mark Freeman, quoting me. Obama quoting himself. Yes, in a way, that is, I think, exactly what is guiding me. And I'm following your and others' lead here, that it is not the person themselves that is doing it. It's not, Nicholas, it's not the social per se that is organizing the principles within which individuals are making sense. I mean, both, all. But how can we move outside of one or the other? And I think this is where we have to be careful. Because reading your work, Marie-Cécile, if I may say this, it sounds like a grand attempt to integrate really different ways of sense making, really different approaches. and bringing them also methodologically down to work with language data. And I just worked with Marie-Cécile for the others because Marie-Cécile submitted a contribution to a handbook that my colleagues, friends, and I are editing. And that's where I thought it is masterfully all put together. But, often, I think most of the times, things are not integratable because there are different metaphors that don't match up. So in other words, I mean, there is, to use a metaphor, there's a metaphor for what a theory is. A theory is like a flashlight. If you use a flashlight, it sheds light on a particular part of what becomes illuminated. And then you need to know you need to bring another flashlight in order to illuminate more or better. Yeah. But this metaphor is deceiving because it assumes that these flashlights, these theories, all go nicely together in concert. They are flashlights that bring light into what we consider research-worthy or issues or problems that are relevant societally or individually. It's deceiving because they are not flashlights that cooperate nicely. At times, there are real frictions. They don't go together. Certain theories rule each other out. And so that's what I would like to bring into this as a way of being wary, being careful with regard to trying to integrate too much.
I have to say something to that. That's a brilliant metaphor of metaphors. I understand, and I worked with metaphors, so I know we are blinded and made seen by metaphors. I would never integrate, Michael. I would never integrate phenomenology and mediated activity because there is an issue with mediacy and immediacy.
Yeah, I'm not saying that.
Things like that, right? And I would also not integrate Cartesianism and Spinozism, of course not. So, but still, we need to integrate body and language and others.
Oh yeah.
Form and meaning.
Oh yeah.
And you will have to be
body is not a theory.
I mean, this is a one-to-one discussion
theory.
maybe, but you will need to be more precise on what I cannot integrate. That would be interesting.
I think we don't have more time. I'm sorry. I think we don't have more time. So, but thank you so much for the interesting discussion. Thank you, Michael, so much for all the replies and questions and everything. The talk, of course. Since we're very past on time, we're going to take 10 minutes. So instead of getting back at 11:30, we will get back at 11:35. It's only 5 minutes more, but so everyone can